Dead is Dead is an amazing episode, and I'm gonna tell you the secrets of the Cerberus chamber. But first, let's go into the episode.
My God. You're alive.
There's something special about Ben episodes and the anticipation of them. The press release for Dead is Dead got leaked in advance. Some people couldn't even believe it, since it felt a little bit too good to be true. The summary seems like the most amazing episode ever. Ben attempts to summon the smoke monster in order to be judged for sins of the past. We're gonna do it all chronologically. The flashbacks, the present, and then at the end we're gonna decode the Cerberus chamber, which is the one that required the most research and probably what you came here to watch. Hope you're already subscribed to this channel, since more analysis is to come. Let's dive in. 1977. We're starting at a new location, the other's campsite in 1977. I've placed it over here. Charles Widmore rides in and meets young Ben. Ben has healed from Saeed's gunshot wound. He's gonna be here for a while before returning to the barracks. As Widmore said,
just because you're living with them doesn't mean you can't be one of us.
Ben will therefore continue to go back and forward in the years to come. It is April 1988. Alex is kidnapped by them a week after her birth. I think this scene works well with what Danielle told us. She said she never saw the others, and even though the crew can't film a pitch black scene since it is television, so they have to rely on studio lights out here to point at the characters. This is in the middle of the night and with no light sources other than the stars and the moon, so it should be much darker than it really is right here. And from Danielle's point of view, Ben's face is cleverly disguised by the blackness. So yeah, I think it makes sense that she wouldn't recognize him when she caught him in the trap 16 years from now. Additionally, we hear her scream for Alex, which is the explanation for how Ben managed to raise the child with that same name. Some people wondered about this before this episode aired, since Alex was taken soon after childbirth, so how would Ben know that her name really was Alex? This episode answers that. Ben and Ethan return to the others' camp, and Widmore is surprised to see they brought Alex. He reminds Ben that he was supposed to kill her. We don't know where the camp is, bear in mind that the location is around the same area we saw them the last time, but honestly, it could be anywhere.
Since when is it your decision, Charles? Is killing this baby what Jacob wants?
Let's see, I'm doing this in. No idea. Who's this baby? Baby? Who the hell is that about? And I want to kill the baby suddenly. All out of the blue. I want to kill the baby.
No, you want him to kill the baby.
As I mentioned in the previous episode and the problem with a baby without breast milk, how did Alex survive? She was a week old. She'd need to be breastfed for the first 6 months of her life. There is the possibility that there were wet nurses amongst the others. A woman who breastfeeds another child. This is an ancient practice. Even mother had to do this while raising Jacob and his brother. Maybe Alex could have survived on cow milk if she was older, but a week old? That's brutal. Regardless of the purge date, Ben would surely snuck around and stolen a lot of formula milk, since that had to be present at the barracks. I know that there's a pregnancy issue going on, but if the pallet drops kept sending formula milk in their resupply drops, then sure, that would be stored at some place on the island. If the Dharma Initiative is dead at this point, he could have convinced them all to move into the barracks. It's suggested by Man in Black Lock that it was Ben's decision to move into the barracks.
Well, your people were living in the jungle, and then after you murdered the Dharma folk, you relocated here. I just wondered if it was your idea.
Do you disapprove, John? It just doesn't seem like something the island would want.
Maybe they did as early as 1988 to raise Alex in a safe environment where she would be able to get breast milk and potentially use the other women as wet nurses. Or else Alex wouldn't have survived. 1988 to 1993. Already in 1988, Charles Widmore had been going to and from the mainland. We don't know when Penny was born, but considering that Sonia Walger was born in 1974, then I think it's fair to say that she is growing up in the UK as we speak. Widmore is not only in London to see her, he's there for business. His business empire is growing, branching in different sections such as construction and laboratories. After the purge, I believe that Widmore might have bought out any remaining labs or storage areas that Dharma had in the mainland and turned it into the Widmore Corporation. Ben was the leader on the island now, to Widmore's frustration. There is a possibility a lot of the people in the group lost his trust after he told Ben to kill the child, a child who was now growing up with them. The others were there when Widmore told Ben to kill it. She would be a stark reminder to the rest of the group that Widmore wanted her dead. which speaks a lot about his character and that they wanted Ben to lead them. He changed up the dynamic, used his Dharma knowledge, let them in on all their secrets, their stations, how to use the sonic fence and so on, as well as how to operate the sub, and he would get people to come to the island and grow his fortune overseas. In 1993, Charles Widmore was forced to leave the island. Richard takes Ben down to the dock.
And one day, you'll be standing where I'm standing now. You'll be the one being banished. And then you'll finally realize that you cannot fight the inevitable.
Let's move to the present. In Ben's office at the Hydra, Ben tells Man in Black Locke he needs to be judged by the Master. Ben and Locke try to take one of the 2 remaining outriggers to go to the main island. When Caesar forbids them to do so, Ben shoots him. Not sure what they do with Caesar's body, just bury him or dump him in the ocean. One of the people present at this situation was Salinger, who is part of Jacob's team. He would tell Ilana that the man masquerading as John Locke took an outrigger and left the island after Ben shot Caesar. Ben and Locke used the outrigger
Home sweet home.
There has been some confusion about the processing center and its relation to the barracks, and in this video I make my arguments on why they are here, but not among the 3 clusters of houses. However, it's easy to make this mistake. For instance, there's a quick shot of the processing center before Ben and Locke enter the barracks, but we don't see them there. They return to Ben's abandoned house over here, where Sun and Lapidus have been waiting for Locke. Sun is here, in Alex's room. Ben enters. Sun shows Ben the photo of the 1977 Dharma recruits, but Ben claims not to know that their friends were there.
Where did you get this? Who gave this to you?
We met some crazy old man outside.
He said his name was Christian. He told us to come in here and wait.
Wait for what?
He said if I ever wanted to see my husband again, I had to wait here for John Locke.
Man in Black Locke goes inside and explains his situation. Then he wanders off into the jungle, while Ben attempts to summon the smoke monster. There are several theories on where he went, but one that I like is that he went down in some of the tunnels, through the barrier in the orchid that isn't affected by the time skips, where John Locke would pop up, changing his form to Christian Shepherd. After all, he's been alternating those 2 forms the past few days, and this is the last time he's gonna appear as Christian, since Jacob's death prevented him from taking multiple forms, and at this point he knows that John Locke needed to die so that his friends would return.
Richard said I was going to die. I suppose that's why they call it sacrifice.
Frank decides to use one of the 2 canoes moored at the dock to go back to the plane to fix the radio to get off the island. Sun prefers to stay and find her husband. Ben enters his secret room through this door with hieroglyphs about summoning, an ancient artifact from the Egyptians, and he attempts to summon the monster from this area. It's kind of like a toilet. Ben has obviously done it before, meaning that the water would fill up the hole after a while, kind of like a toilet. We don't see the cork that Ben twists, so I think that when he turns it, it goes down like this, like a drain, and then after a while the water will rise and the cork will go up and lock itself into position. And there's some moisture over here and some water could drip into this puddle. But where does the water go? One theory I like is that it's connected to the heart of the island. We see 4 openings here, which is clearer in the behind the scenes pictures by the sculptor, and they can be connected to 4 summoning holes. These 4 holes could be connected to the Cerberus vents, as well as flowing into other places on the island. As mentioned in the video on the Blaster map, Radzinski noted down 4 Cerberus vents, here, 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 and here at the temple. And we see that the stream of water goes down the waterfall into the circular pool of light and flows into these 4 mouths, which I think exist underneath the island, like a tree with many branches all over the island. One of them likely goes all the way up here to the frozen chamber and mixes with another pocket of energy, while another one goes to the temple. And maybe since this Smokey Toilet is so close to the temple, maybe that has a separate system that goes in here. I don't think the water drains from the barracks to the heart of the island, since that would take a very long time and the monster showed up quickly in the shape of things to come, but I do believe it's all connected. We do know that there are tunnels directly underneath the barracks, so it's possible that one of these mouths in the heart of the island has a tunnel of water going all the way up here, and the Smokey Toilet just goes into a system underneath the barracks that channels the water and the electromagnetic energy, alerting the monster that someone flushed at the summoning chamber. Smokey is tied to the island. His energy depended on the heart of the island. When it's gone, he's reduced to a human. So it's not like Smokey has to be in the pool of water and observe that someone has flushed it. He would sense it, just like he would sense that there are dead bodies on the island. Meanwhile, at the Hydra Island beach, Ilana and Bram have acquired guns. They could have gone down the ladder to the submerged area at the Hydra station and found the weapons locker that Jack found, and found some of the rifles there. The weapons locker could have been updated with some of the guns that the others acquired after Jack was there in Aidu. Some of the other Ajiro survivors are scared by this. They just wanted to get to Guam and want to get rescued, but everyone else is just busy doing other stuff. It's the next morning. Lapidus arrives. They come and they ask him what lies in the shadow of the statue, before knocking him out. Man in Black Lock, take Ben and Son over here, to the monster's hole. I think they take this pass here, which was previously blocked, but might have been cleared by now in 2007. They arrive at the wall. Son stays outside while they go down.
I'll meet you outside. If I live. Ben!
The Cerberus chamber. Ben enters and falls through the floor to an underground hall with hieroglyphs and a mural. We've already explored Dharma's name for it, Cerberus, named after the three-headed dog that guarded the Underworld in Greek mythology, which is what this chamber is often called amongst the fanbase. But in this episode we're gonna explore the Egyptian mythology. I'm sorry I haven't made a complete full map of the temple, but it will come. It's going to make more sense to introduce it in the season 6 premiere, but let's examine the chamber. I don't think it's in much use anymore. There doesn't seem to be an entrance here, and it was likely boarded up with rocks a long time ago. The walls go a little bit higher here, and there's some light coming in here, possibly through some cracks in the wall, but from a production standpoint they have to light here, since this is a TV show. It can't be pitch black.
We built a duplicate of the tunnel section above the chamber to match the part where they walked just before the drop. Because we wanted to create backlight to see the smoke monster, we left the ceiling at the side walls so that they could be lit easily. And then created the freestanding center section containing the 4 columns in the center of the room.
Just like the issue of whether or not the Purge happened in 1987 or 1992, we have another timeline issue. Did the Egyptians come here before or after Across the Sea? Without looking outside the island, there is a lot of support in the show that the Egyptians came here after that time, due to the story that Jacob tells on the tapestry, as well as the audio commentary for Across the Sea.
If I were to have a theory that that apparatus that we see in the finale with the stone sticking in the middle of the pool that's sort of blocking the light, then maybe that apparatus wasn't created until after this event.
I think that's an incredibly likely deduction.
It fits with Jacob's motives and what he tells us, as well as that we know that the wheel chamber was constructed after Across the Sea. The island we see in Across the Sea is pretty deserted, and Claudia's people are the first ones that Mother encountered. The statue of Tavaret and all of that were built by an enormous civilization, but we see none of it in Across the Sea. I think that because of it, it's a fair deduction that Jacob brought these builders to the island, and that Man in Black's followers completed the frozen wheel and carved in the hieroglyphics on the stone walls after Across the Sea. Or else Across the Sea surely would have shown Claudia's people inhabit some of the already built structures, or the enormous statue of Tavaret, or anything like that, right? I don't want to settle it, since I think you should still have your own interpretation on it. Let's look at the insides of this chamber to see if we can piece together a timeline. Here's Across the Sea, starting from prehistoric Egypt, 3100 BC, and lasting up to the end of the Ptolemaic period, 30 BC. But during the Roman Empire, there still was a province in Egypt called Roman Egypt, one who still worshipped Egyptian gods and used hieroglyphs, from 30 BC to 641 AD.
Now, hieroglyphs had been used in Egypt in a more primitive form as early as 3000 BCE. And the last inscription, I'm trying to think exactly when, it's 5th century CE, and it's at a place called Philae.
But at the end of this chamber is a vast illustration of one of the oldest gods, Anubis, who is kneeling down to a being just as tall as he is, a being that might be Apep, a deity of destruction. It's not really consistent with how Egyptians drew Apep, which was depicted smaller and bendier, and sometimes it was depicted as a crocodile, so it might not be it. The island is the only place in the world with a smoke monster, so the people who carved this made it into a different being, possibly combining Apep and Smokey, since Smokey differs in shape from a snake, combining their own religion with something unique. Down below we have some other snakes, smaller than Anubis and the smoke monster. The role of Anubis in Egyptian mythology is older than the Romans on the island. Anubis, as the lord of the underworld, was replaced by Osiris almost 2000 years before across the sea. The Osiris myth became more popular, the latter god took on more and more of Anubis' attributes. Even the stone cork suggests that, since it references Osiris rather than Anubis. Most of the depictions of him are ancient, with him popping up as early as the First Dynasty, 3100 BC to 2900 BC. However, depictions of Anubis were still popular during the Roman era. Being such a popular god, he survived on in other periods, so that doesn't crack the theory. The stone cork scene in the series finale is a little bit puzzling. It is suggested in the audio commentary that the whole system in the heart of the island was created after Man in Black turned into the smoke monster, but the stone cork has Akkadian cuneiforms, another extinct language, replaced by Aramaic. During the first millennium BC, Akkadian progressively lost its status as lingua franca, the common tongue. In the beginning, from around 1000 BC, Akkadian and Aramaic were of equal status. Clay tablets were written in Akkadian, while scribes written on papyrus and leather used Aramaic. The latest known use of that language is, however, from 75 AD. Then that could still be made post across the sea, even though it would be quite rare. When it comes to the Akkadian cuneiforms, then we could also have a situation where this could have been passed down in generations to whoever came to the island, or it could have been passed down to Mother from someone she encountered who died or that she killed, and then later to Jacob. Jacob, by being a protector, simply knows several languages, Greek being among them, and we later see him perfectly fluent in English and Korean. Some have argued that the stone cork had to be created before across the sea, but being able to write an old language is still possible years after the language has been common tongue and no longer in use. But what I find interesting is that the episode that comes right after this one introduces us to a timeline regarding the Egyptians and their language, predating across the sea. The Dharma classroom shows us this, one of the very few instances where a timeline is presented on the show, showing us archaic Egyptian 2600 BC, Old Egyptian 2600 to 2000 BC, Middle Egyptian 2000 to 1300 BC, Late Egyptian 1300 BC to 700 BC. If the show wanted to tell us and teach us that people used hieroglyphs in Egypt during the Roman Empire, wouldn't they show us a timeline well into Anno Domini? Maybe I'm overanalyzing, but I'm putting everything on the table, as well as this timeline. The sculptor who did this thing also did a lot of stuff at the temple in season 6. His nickname being Skullboy, he added a skull here to the hieroglyphs. He's actually hidden a skull to everything he's made for the show, although he is the one who gets the instructions from the crew on what to sculpt. The production has specialists to help them with the hieroglyphs. Anubis and the smoke monster is not the only thing present on that wall, even though this third layer is the most important one. We have this symbol. This symbol is the symbol for Duat, the underworld. So it's fitting that it is behind the smoke monster, as if this rectangle is supposed to be the underworld, while the rest is not. Like the rest here is the people, and over here are like some spells and chants and stories, while this is depicting this exact chamber. The Ankh here is also upside down, which was not really that common to depict in that era. On the first and fourth level, you have a series of vignettes.
If it's in a temple, then this is the home of the gods. The hieroglyphic inscription is meant to give offerings to the gods in perpetuity, for forever. And then in return, the gods will then give to the king and to all of Egypt all of the things that they need.
Did you know that this top layer and the bottom layer is actually copied directly from the Metternich Stela, a steel plate dating from 380 to 342 BC. This find was discovered by someone from the Lost Forum, the fuselage. And you can see that this portion is identical to this one from the mural in the chamber. Just look, it incorporates part of this story, and then these stairs only flipped, and this area matches this one over here. This is from the backside of the stela. The function was as follows: you poured water over the stela and you absorbed the power of all the gods and demons, and then you'd be protected when you drank the run of water from it. Sounds very similar to the way water is used later on in the series, especially the one that goes into the heart of the island. According to Egyptology lessons, this is an assemblage of symbols and immortal beings in order to provide the best type of protection for the living. It is showing us various immortals battling animals like a crocodile and scorpions. These animals are not seen on the island, but since this story has been taken from the Metinic stela, then the one who carved it here simply copied some parts of it. It stood in Heliopolis for many years, until Alexander the Great conquered the Persians in Egypt in 332 BC. He brought it back to Alexandria in Egypt, where it was stored. So this stela doesn't contradict anything though, and it could be observed at various times. It could have been seen in Alexandria, and then someone could have traveled from that seaport and wound up on the island, telling this story on the mural. Even used the lighthouse at Alexandria as an inspiration to build the lighthouse on the island. However, one thing that is set in stone in the timeline are the pillars. They contain cursive hieroglyphs. They were not used to carve into stone, but on papyrus or leather. Rip Van on Lostpedia suggested that they came from the Book of the Dead, an ancient Egyptian funerary text generally written on papyrus. But the thing is, there are several versions of it. For instance, if someone wanted to be buried with a Book of the Dead, they personally would get a couple of squires to write it, and then when they die, they would use this papyrus, which would be filled with spells that they thought they would need to get through to the weighing chamber at the end, the Hall of Judgment, where Anubis would be, before their spirits would go into the afterlife. To me, it almost seems like the builders of this room created a journey into the Duat, the Underworld. If the tunnel entrance with the water is like the beginning and it goes through here and then ends up in the Cerberus chamber, then it's almost like this whole thing is supposed to represent the journey that a soul took before they faced off with Anubis in the Hall of Judgment at the end. Fits perfectly with Ben in this episode. So I decided to see if it was true. Did the pillars contain a passage from the Book of the Dead? Luckily, after a couple of days of looking through what felt like an endless amount of papyrus scrolls, I found it. In the 18th sheet. In the Papyrus of Ani. There it is. It's a match. Ani was a real man from Thebes who died in 1250 BC. He made sure that some scribes would customize a Book of the Dead for him, and this long papyrus scroll is quite impressive. It details his story through the Underworld, because when they die, their spirit go through a chasm in the Duat, where there are lakes of fire, mystical doors, various creatures to bypass, and so on. One of the creatures is the snake Apep, which I mentioned, who is lurking in the shadows. These specific spells that Ani wanted in his scroll would help him get through it, and in the end, meet Anubis. Anubis would weigh Ani's heart, which would decide whether or not he would be passed into the afterlife. If Ani was mummified and placed in a sarcophagus with a scroll of his Book of the Dead, an object that wouldn't see the light of day until it was uncovered by the British several thousands years later, the man who discovered it in the late 1800s said that it was bound with a thin papyrus string and was perfectly preserved, with a clay seal that joined the ends of the string also intact. How did it appear in the Cerberus chamber? The reading in Ani's papyrus is as follows. Underneath the story of the scribe Ani passing through the door of the tomb, outside are his shadow and his soul in the form of a human-headed bird, and for my shade so that it may see the great God on the day of the examining of the souls. I tried to Google the phrasing that is uttered here on the pillar, and the most similar one would be the sheet number 6 of the papyrus of Nebseni. It starts the same but doesn't end the same. Ani's line ends with "on the day of the examining of the souls," while Nebseni's text ends with on the day of the counting of the souls, which is pretty much the same thing, but it's written differently in Ani's papyrus. After all, the papyruses were customized to that specific individual. This was, after all, his Book of the Dead. It further emphasizes that whoever inscribed these things on the pillars on the island were either the same scribes that customized Ani's papyrus or duplicated it in the exact same way it was written. The phrase is repeated on the various columns, such as here and in the Jughead chamber. The pillars in the tunnel entrance have a lot of repetition actually. From a production standpoint, the crew probably wanted a passage that reflected something about entering a chamber of judgment and found a line from the papyrus of Ani, since that is the most famous today, and just copied it onto the pillar. But if we look at it through our timeline, does this mean that the Egyptians came here at this point in time before across the sea? It's a bit more complicated than that. I'll present 4 options. One option is that the scribe in Thebes 1300 years before Christ arrived on the island, maybe with his family or a group of other linguists, just so that the Akkadian cuneiforms could be taught and replicated on the island, and they started creating these holy chambers and lived here for over 1000 years until a new group added more to the chamber from the Metternich Stela and continued helping them build the other structures on the island. That's a cool theory, but I have some problems with it, because I've started to doubt that the scribes actually wrote these things on the pillars. Because it's a bit weird. Why write certain things that are usually written on papyrus in cursive hieroglyphs onto a stone pillar and repeat it? And that's not the only thing that is repeated. I double checked the plate here, the copy of the Metternich Stela, and saw these hieroglyphs. I don't know what they mean, since I'm not an Egyptologist, but I'm good at spotting things, and I see that these are repeated on this column here and here. In the papyrus of Ani, the spells and stories are written from top to bottom, but these are written out of sequence, from this side to this side. I think that means that whoever made this thing was not the actual scribe from Thebes. He wouldn't deviate from his own structure like that, would he? Nor do I believe he would live so long as to be here for the Metternich Stela. In this picture you see more clearly that the ornamental plaque is possibly carved out separately. It could have been created at a separate point in time, because there are at least 1000 years separating the papyrus of Ani and the Metternich Stela. So I think it's likely that if there were Egyptians during this time, they did not complete their building project, or they carved out this part but the top and bottom layer was created much later. The second option is that the scribe in Thebes, who wrote Ani's papyrus, duplicated some of its parts and just kept it for himself, passed it on for over 1000 years, and then the Egyptians from Roman Egypt brought along some treasures from their ancestors and then copied Ani's passage on the pillars. Or the third option is that the papyrus copies of Ani's scroll were placed in a crate and washed up on the beach. Timeline here is not relevant, since they could have slipped through the barrier and wound up in a different time, like Doc Ray's body, or just wound up on some rocks and stayed there for over 1000 years, untouched and preserved, until someone found it and decorated the chambers with it. The fourth theory is probably the one I subscribe to the most. It bridges on from the first theory, that the scribes from Thebes and potentially other linguists sailed up the Nile. Egyptians were competent sailors and sailed throughout the Nile during ancient Egypt. And then something happened, the ship wandered off and they wound up on the island. They were here for a short while and then died out. Like I said, there's so many years between this group's death. Maybe due to the volcano erupting, maybe mother killed them, maybe other injuries, who knows. But their papyruses of stories and notes were stored on the island, maybe in one of the chambers if they started building them, in a place that wouldn't be discovered by Claudia's people, nor Manning Black during his human time. The years passed. Jacob would bring Egyptians from Roman Egypt, who desperately want to maintain their beliefs and culture, and bring it to the island. There probably was a large group sailing from Alexandria, a group of people who were already worshipping Egyptian gods, knew hieroglyphs, as well as people who had seen the Metternich Stela. They would create an enormous civilization here and build the statue of Tavrat. Later, these Egyptians would discover this hidden and finished vault and then turn it into their chamber. Someone probably copied stuff from the papyrus scroll over 1000 years after they were put here. Hence why the very unconventional methods, things being out of order, as well as depicting the Ankh upside down. They might have thought that these chambers were the literal chambers from the weighing of the heart, as described in the Book of the Dead, the physical presence of the Duat in the world. They wouldn't know that cursive hieroglyphs don't usually go on to walls like that, but they would recognize Anubis and the notes about the Hall of Judgment. And the stories about Ani were replicated onto the pillars. Egyptians placed much value in the afterlife, and if they encountered a being, the Man in Black, who could literally take the shape of their lost loved ones, then obviously he would be considered a god to them. These people were now worshipping the Man in Black as a deity that was summoned by Anubis himself, and they would continue to build the tunnels out of this chamber, as well as helped him finish the wheel chamber too. I don't really have much problem with some Egyptians coming to the island prior to the events of Across the Sea, kind of like Widmore's group coming in 2004 and then in 2007, or that you have both Oceanic Flight 815 and Agira Flight 316, that this classroom setting is one way of telling the audience that all of this that is taught here is part of an ancient story that is just the backbone to the story of Lost, but not something we'll take part of it. The last time we were here, the children were taught the story of the volcano. Here they are taught of stuff we won't see on the show. Heck, there's even a drawing of the volcano here, as well as a dinosaur. Then we have Mother. Was she part of this timeline? Was she a smoke monster? Did the scribes from Thebes build the Cerberus vent over here? Did she coincidentally act similarly to her adoptive son, influencing earlier Egyptians? Or was this whole thing created later when Man in Black took over? That's all great questions, but we'll save Mother for season 6. There are theories that Man in Black had much more control of the temple to begin with, and was perhaps the one who influenced the Egyptians to build it, at least the underground chamber, where he travels. However, something changed. There are newer elements at the temple, especially the building style of the various walls in the Dravidian architectural style, which I believe was built by civilization much later, consisting of people from South Asia, Hindus and Buddhists. Before that time, I think Egyptians built the tunnels, and I think the Man in Black tricked and influenced them into doing so. It could be Jacob's newer generation, people from this era who blocked off the Cerberus chamber, closed it up and kept it like that for centuries, until Ben fell through the floor. Unless it was Man in Black Locke, who made sure those rocks would bulge under Ben's feet, so that he could enter his own chamber. The monster surrounds Ben, showing him memories of Alex and Widmore, including her death. The monster goes back into the vent and appears in the form of Alex, warns him before she disappears, and then reappears as Man in Black Locke. Next week will be a breather, away from Egyptian mythology and to a shorter episode, a fun ride on the island. Thanks a lot to the YouTube channel Egyptology Lessons for a lot of information provided here.